So today I'm going to show you how to make a cheese sauce or a white sauce. I'm going to use the roux method, so I'll show you how to start that. I've got 30 grams of butter in my pan. So I've just light the flame underneath and I'll wait for my butter to melt. So I've got a wooden spoon. You can see that's starting to melt there. Now the difference between a roux sauce and an all-in-one sauce is that a roux sauce, we're going to combine the butter and the flour to make ourselves a paste. So our butter's melting nicely. Be careful when you're melting your butter. You don't want to overcook it because you can burn it quite easily and it'll start to turn brown. So I'm just going to keep mine moving to make sure that the bits that are already melted don't burn. There you go, it's getting there. Now I've already weighed out all of my ingredients. My cheese sauce is actually going to be for the top of a lasagna. So you want it to be a reasonably thick consistency. You want it to be thicker than a custard. So I've got 30 grams of butter there. I'm just swirling that round in the pan. 30 grams of butter, and I'm using exactly the same amount of flour. So there's my butter melted. I'm just going to turn the heat down. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the flour. So I've already weighed out my 30 grams of flour. I'm going to pour the flour in. And then I'm going to make a paste. Now I'm going to do this just off the heat. I'm just going to make a paste. You can see it's quite a thick paste. So that's the butter and the flour all mixed together. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully add my milk. Now I've got 300 millilitres of milk. So notice that 300 is 10 times the ingredients for the butter and the flour. So it was 30 grams of butter and flour, it's 300 millilitres of milk. So you could factor that up to be 50 grams and 50 grams and 500 ml, for example. Notice I've just poured a little in. I am still slightly off the heat. So I'm now mixing that roux with the milk. Just to thin it out a little bit, I'm going to go again with a little bit more. Okay, keep mixing. You don't want any lumps. You don't want any lumps forming in that sauce. Still got a reasonable amount of milk left. And go for a little bit more. Notice I'm still off the heat. I'm just slightly over it because of that's where my camera is set up. Oops, spilt a little bit. Not a problem. Okay, and then some more. Now I'm going to go for the rest of the milk there and give it a stir. Now, I'm just going to mop that up. I'm going to leave that on the heat. Now the key thing is with any sauce, whether you're using the all-in-one method or the roux method, the key thing is to keep stirring. And just to demonstrate something for you, I'm going to take a spoonful, small spoonful. I'm going to pop it on this tray, this plate. You can see it spreads out quite easily. I'm just not sure what's there. Spreads out quite easily on our plate there. So I'm going to compare that at the end to what happens at the end of our sauce. So I'm going to keep stirring for a good few minutes. Now what's happening here is something called gelatinization. So when this gets to around about 60 degrees, the starch granules, now remember the starch is in the flour, when those starch granules get heated up at about 60 degrees, they're going to start to swell. Now what happens when they start to swell is they start to absorb the liquid. So that's what's happening, is they're absorbing the liquid in our sauce. As they start to swell, they start to take up more space. And as they take up more space, the sauce starts to thicken. So that's what's going to happen to our sauce. By the time they get to 80 degrees, the granules will actually start to burst. Okay, and when that happens, that's known as gelatinization. Just clearing the plate there so I can show you later. So keep stirring. Now that's going to happen because we've got a metal pan. That's going to happen first of all around the bottom of our pan. So make sure you're getting all the way to the bottom with your stirring. Make sure you are getting all the way to the edges. Now, if you do just take your eye off this for a minute, or you do get distracted, one of the key things you can do to rescue it is use your friend the whisk. Now, I can feel my sauce starting to thicken now. Probably a little bit more tricky for you to be able to see any difference. So I'm just going to keep stirring until that thickens up. Now, as you can see, I've left my sauce simmering for a few minutes. You might be able to tell there that it is actually thickening up quite nicely. I will show you on the plate in a second. But it must have reached roughly 100 degrees, because if I leave that to its own devices, you should be able to see it starting to bubble away there. I'm going to stir it because I don't really want it to bubble too much. You should be able to see that's thickened up quite nicely. I wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't nice and thick. So I'm going to turn off the heat. So this is our sauce. So remember, this is a roux sauce. Here's my plate. If I drop, remember it was about a teaspoon. Put that on the plate this time. You can definitely see the difference there. Now, what we call the thickness of a sauce, another word for it is the viscosity. So if it's very viscous, it means it's a very thick mixture. So it means it's not runny. If it's less viscous, that means it's more runny. So the next thing that is left for me to do, I've still turned it off, remember? Not got any heat there now. I'm going to put some cheese in it. So the heat that's in that sauce will melt the cheese. If it's grated, then the cheese is smaller. Should help it melt much more easily and much more quickly. But give it a good stir because you don't want your sauce to be lumpy. So I'm going to stir that through. There's my cheese sauce, all ready to go on top of my lasagna. Here's my ragu, which is my meat and tomato sauce. That's going to form the main body of my lasagna. Now, I've left this simmering for about 30 minutes, so about half an hour. Now, what's happened to it is I used some tomato in there. It was quite runny tomato, something called passata. And what happens when you leave it to simmer for about half an hour is the extra liquid in there has evaporated, and that means it's called a reduction sauce. So reduction because it reduces in size. So there was more of it, the extra water has evaporated, so you can see the little bubbles there as it simmers, and you can see the steam probably coming off there. That steam is that extra water leaving the dish, and that leads to the sauce being reduced in size, so it's a reduction sauce. Now, this would also happen if you were making something like a curry, or if you're making a chili, which is very similar. So that would reduce in size, and that is what a reduction sauce is.